Welcome to another episode of the Roundtable. Today, we're going to be talking about structure and flexibility. I guess today we'll try to cover why we're going to implement more structure in someone's program, why we might take it away and opt towards a more flexible approach. And to kick things off, Sam, did you want to start things? Let's go with how much structure or flexibility should we consider when you're writing a program for someone for the first time?
For the very first time, I think it's important to kind of, in the initial consultation, develop their program around their lifestyle, their work schedule, any kind of external factors that they communicate can affect training, and try and build the program around when they're going to be able to perform the best on those days. So I guess in the initial stages when working with someone, we try and create as much structure as possible to create predictability in the programming right from the get-go, working collaboratively with the athlete. So I guess in that sense, we're flexible in the approach that we can kind of make anything really work with the athlete in order to have structure. So they kind of work both hand in hand, I guess you could say.
Yeah. When I think about when I first write the program, right, I'm thinking of like what's the bare minimum that they need in terms of structure when you write it up. So then as things start to evolve, you can start to implement little things here and there, like changing days, things like that, where you're not so focused on planning what's going to happen in 6 or 8 weeks, right? You're just planning, 1 week worth of training and see if that works, fitting within their lifestyle, fatigue, everything like that. So
yeah,
I think we're sorry, you go, Sam.
I was going to say, yeah, on that, I guess probably a big thing with that then in terms of the structure of the actual program is looking at how much they've done in the past, looking how much they need to push strength progression and get stronger from a volume, intensity, and frequency standpoint. And then, yeah, taking that information on board in terms of their lifestyle and external factors, structuring the program around that.
Yeah. I was gonna touch upon Shania, did you have anything to add to that as well?
No, I was just gonna say like it's kind of what Sam said, like structure but flexibility is like works hand in hand. I think too it's like looking at what they've been doing. So it's like if they followed a program before, like are they doing like 5 days, but it's like a whole kind of just bunch of like everything that isn't really like specific to powerlifting. Like is there just like a lot of sort of like fluff in the program in a way? So like can you actually condense that into like 3 or 4 days, which is gonna make obviously less stress on them in terms of having to get into the gym so many times a week, but then that will obviously create more flexibility. And then I was just gonna, more predictability. And then I was just gonna say, like a lot of my clients, I've got a lot of nurses, so like having same training days is like almost like impossible. So it's like still creating the program when you are doing that first initial consultation that some session is going to set them up for, the next session, or like bench is still laid out where there's like, potentially one day that's like a primer day that's going to come from rest, or primer day that will come from, being set up the day before, like a primer day. But it's then just taking it week to week. So it's like communicating to them that like they need to look at like what their work schedule looks like and then be able to plan their training days pretty much every week just on the fly. So like you still have the predictability of how the program is structured and laid out, but you just have to like work with it every week and look at what their schedule is, a month in advance, to be able to communicate to them how that looks, because creating predictability for them makes it harder because they don't get to change their work schedule.
Yeah, and I think on your end, right, like in terms of structure, you can't really fix them into a box where it's like this day always needs to be strong just due to specifically lifestyle, right? So I'm curious with that specifically, say like with how we think about like primary and secondary days and things like that, for someone who is going through like a not set schedule, are you constantly changing days between secondary and primary day, and which day is stronger?
Pretty much. It's just like a matter of like communication, basically. So like me communicating, obviously, like if that, like in that first initial consultation, why the program is laid out, how it's laid out, and then communicating like hypothetical situations. So it's like, hypothetically, if like this is how your work week is laid out and you can train on, these days, and it lines up perfectly where like there's, adequate rest between like a tertiary squat and a primary squat day, then, roll with that. Whereas like if there isn't, then it's like adjusting on the fly for that week, where it's like communicating, take load off this day if you need to, so that we're not carrying too much fatigue if it needs to be like a back-to-back kind of session. So that is very much what is sort of communicated on the fly. Whereas, yeah, like obviously people who can train the same days every week in, week out, it's a lot, I guess, easier, because once the training days are set, it's just set.
Yeah. And I think you bring up a good point about like being able to make decisions on the fly, right? Or I think what I've heard coined from like Joy Flex, sometimes Steve mentions it, is like calling audibles. So like within a given session or within a week where something might pop up, right? Like you're able to adjust on the fly and deal with the situation at hand. And I think that's really powerful, because at the end of the day, right, like when you create that initial structure, it's there if everything's in an ideal world. But we live in the real world where people have jobs, other stresses that might take priority over training. And so therefore being able to adjust and I guess minimize the downside of potential risk or like stalling the program is where you're going to see long-term progress, right? Because
Definitely.
I think like when we think of structure, right, like back in however long ago, like back when I first started, it'd be like you plan 4 or 5 weeks, that's a 4 or 5 week locked in structure. And it's it'll touch into like top down versus bottom up programming.
Yeah.
Right.
I think the hardest thing too is like just managing more so like the mental frustration of it for them, because it's like they could have one week where their work schedule and external stresses is like the ideal week that I guess like a lot of us who have the same training days is, where it's like, every session sets them up for the next and there's no sort of fatigue carryover and it's perfect. And then it's like the next week their work schedule could be like absolute dog shit. And like I feel like nurses get the worst schedule. Like they might work like one week they get like 4 or 5 nights in a week, whereas like the next they're only working like 2-day shifts, So it's more managing the mental side of it as well. So I communicate with my clients a lot as well, to just like in every session that you do on the week that like is not the ideal structure for your work, just write in what days you train, so that it's like the next week, if you do have the most ideal sort of training week, or vice versa, they can go back and they can see, okay, this day was back to back, or like every day was back to back, so no wonder why I felt like crap, whereas like the next week it's different. And then it also gives me that data when then I go in and I'm looking back at their program, I can see which days they trained on, where fatigue fed into the next session, where there was interference or where there wasn't, basically. And like that just helps with then like the more predictability and then building block to block.
Yeah. And touching on that as well, you mentioned predictability, right? So I think building predictability in someone's program is going to be very different depending on the situation. Like if you've got people who are able to train same day, like routines very much set in stone, like it's easier on the coaching end to be able to like manipulate the smaller variables, right? Like volume, intensity, frequency, and you can kind of tinker with it. But with someone like a nursing or like a night shift, like inconsistent schedule, right? Like you can't really bank on the fact that if you make this small change, it's going to show up, just because fatigue is so volatile. Right.
Yeah, and I think that does lead into like competition, where it's like, I guess the best example I have, or the most recent, would be my online client Kayla, who did First Nations. Like for her, I guess, and for people who do have quite an unpredictable schedule, it may be about like not trying to take more on the platform, because you don't know if like the fatigue build up during a comp prep is obviously like, it may be a mixture of both, obviously their work stress and then like training as well. So for her, it was very much creating an environment where it was like, okay, whatever we hit in training is likely going to be just what we take on the platform, because, knowing whether you have 2.5, 5 kilos, 7.5 kilos more on a lift, we don't really have that predictability, because like there's not as much predictability in the program. So you don't know, like, I guess, how much more you can take. So that's sort of like another factor as well.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think just touching on like predictability with shift workers and these clients that have like these absolute terrible or inconsistent schedules. I think obviously like as coaches, we want to create as much predictability as possible with the program layout. But I think with these kind of athletes, it's more about creating predictability by just placing the sessions on when they know they're going to feel the best. So like obviously on a grand scale, we get tertiary squat or your volume squats and make sure they have at least some sort of rest before their primary squat, or that they're breaking up the heavy squats and deadlifts. But I think like with these kind of athletes, if it comes to like them pushing a session forward, just because they're not going to be coming off 12, 14-hour night shift and they're going to feel the best, then we're pretty much taking predictability in the sense that they're probably going to get more out of that primary session by pushing a day forward. Like, yes, it's not going to be ideal because it's one less day rest, and that's different to the last 2 weeks, or 2 less days rest, whatever it is. I think it's important just to create predictability by, communicating with them and when they're training in these heavy sessions, and then just getting them to understand when they're most likely going to feel the best outside of their external variables, and just hitting it then.
Yeah. I kind of wanted to zoom out and kind of think about like we mentioned, predictability, right? So when would you be able, or what are some ways that we can kind of influence programming and things like that in order to increase predictability? So it doesn't necessarily have to be in a situation where like someone's got this rigid structure or someone's like a shift worker with an inconsistent schedule. But what are the big things that you think about that help aid for predictability?
I like to think about spacing. So like, how many days rest does someone need to feel strong on a certain day? So if they squat on a Monday, do they feel good on the Wednesday, the Thursday, the Friday? How many days do they need after like a stimulus of squatting to make their next squat day feel strong? And then going from there. So if they generally feel good after 2 days rest with squat, does that change if the intensity is higher on that first squat day, if the volume's higher on that first day? And then getting an idea of what kind of spacing we actually need between squat sessions to, actually come in strong and have a productive session. Same thing with bench, right? If you have a volume session, have a day off, do you come in really strong, or do you need like a bit of exposure to something heavy before you really turn up and show up for bench? So finding those sorts of trends and finding the sort of spacing you need is generally where I'll start and try and figure that out first. And then sort of, get down to the nitty gritty with like, okay, this much volume, this much intensity, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah. And to tie that in with like flexibility and structure, right? Like when you are trying to increase predictability starting off, you're going to take a more flexible approach with things, right? Because you're not sure about how things are going. Like at best, it's probably an approximation for you as a coach when you are prescribing the program, and then you're watching how things play out, right? So you need to be, I guess, highly reactive as to how things are trending. But then once you get to a point where it's like you can consistently see what's happening, that's where you can start to see predictability starting to play a part. And you can go, okay, so if I add or remove a bit of stress here, that's going to influence here in a positive or negative manner. That's where you can start to get a more clearer picture of things rather than just shooting blanks in the dark and just hoping that something sticks. You need that time to kind of see how things go first, and then you change. And I think it also helps with structure as well, right? Because I feel like for some people that I work with now, like we've gotten through numerous blocks to the point where we do have that predictability and we can see what's going to happen. And we have data to back that now, right? So what we could do is we could plan 3-4 weeks in advance to kind of lead up to something that we want to aim for. For example, like we've got Jason Raby for World's Prep. He's going to be competing October, I believe. So like 2 months or something like that. And so in the lead up to that, we've looked at all the data that he's built up over the past since March. And essentially we're trying to replicate that performance because it worked, and then just work backwards all the way up to this. Right. But that wouldn't have happened if we just went straight from structure from the get-go and kind of imposed like what we think is going to happen onto the client, and then kind of watch what happens after. We kind of just need to let things play out and then see what happens, and then we can impose structure after that.
Well, yeah, I think like what David just said, where like if you're looking at like obviously what one session does in order to make another session strong, so like secondary or like secondary squat, it's like a primary squat, and you're looking at like the amount of days between it, like that can obviously then help create structure for somebody who does work inconsistent shifts, right? Because their week doesn't necessarily have to start on a Monday. So like if their schedule doesn't, like their work schedule doesn't allow for that, like you can communicate, okay, like we know that if you have 2 days between secondary squat and primary squat and that's what makes you strong, then make sure that like you're lining the amount of days up in terms of rest between like X session and then Y session. And then that's what creates the predictability too, rather than like their week starting on a Monday and then they have like, 3 to 4 days rest between their next squat session. And that's what creates the unpredictability. So I think that's like how it's like also like flexible at the same time, because if you're not someone who can have consistent training days, your week doesn't have to start on a Monday. Like your week can start on whatever day that it might look like that fits best to your work schedule, and then like allows you to still get all your training days in that 1 week technically.
Yeah, like I think to touch on that as well, like there were periods of time back when I was training and like it wouldn't matter that we'd be starting on Monday. I think my program would start on a Tuesday as well, right? And I think that also, on a side note, kind of influences the way you might like perceive time as well. I think for some people, like depending on where your training schedule is, it might like you just feel fresher generally, right? Because after 14 hours of work, like obviously with fatigue shooting up, you're just not going to have the intent to train, things like that. But the thing that you're trying to keep consistent is that sense of intent and recovery and being able to just manage it for that week. And eventually things are going to roll around anyways, right? Like when someone is going through a higher external stress period, like you're not expecting a high performance either. So it's more about managing expectations for that week, even though it might be disappointing because you might feel like you're failing to gain this momentum week to week, but it's like it's being built over the course of a block, right? So long as you maintain some semblance of a structure, even if it doesn't start on a Monday. So I think where we can go from here, I guess, is where do you guys start to implement more structure then? Because we talked about predictability and structure, or predictability and how that leads with like flexibility and structure. When do you start to impose more like, okay, we can see what's happening and you can start to plan further ahead?
I think what you just touched on, Danny, like working backwards with Jason's program, I think like once we have spent enough time with someone and we gather enough data to have that ability to work backwards from like a competition, that's when we kind of start to look at more structure in terms of block length, probably especially in terms of timing blocks, so we can kind of macro plan their training to peak them for that competition. So I think probably, the main thing in terms of structure would be, obviously heading into a competition, being able to work backwards, planning training blocks so that, we're making sure they're peaking at the right time. But like you said, we can only really do that once we've started working with someone for an extended amount of time, say at least 2 blocks, to get some sort of good data on how they respond and how long they can kind of run for, and what works from a secondary primary standpoint in terms of like percentage, volume, and intensity. So I think starting to implement more structure, basically just after we've run 1 or 2 blocks with someone and we can kind of see how they respond.
Yeah, I think touching on that, right? Like, I think 1 or 2 blocks is a good place for you to start to pick things up, but it doesn't necessarily have to be 2 blocks, right? Because you might be making these small changes over time. And, sometimes it might take longer for you to come across a response that you're looking for. Other times it might just happen in that first block. Like you write something and it just goes crazy, right? And you're just following that straight away. So I think it's just managing expectations, I guess, from athlete to coach, and expecting that the coach has like experience backing them and seeing some sort of pattern recognition prior to working together. But at the end of the day, everything's just individualized as well, right? So, like that comes with dealing with uncertainty, and both parties are dealing with that. And so therefore, I think being able to recognize when things are working out well and also when it's not working out well is very important, rather than just, like we touched upon earlier, just starting straight with structure and thinking that we have this like magic golden ball to predict what's going to happen in 12 weeks. Because I don't think that's not how things work. And I don't think that's even how it works like once you've gained like 10 years worth of experience. At the end of the day, it's always going to fall back on the person in front of you and then building from where your starting place is essentially.
Yeah, and I think like, I was gonna say like touching on that too, like it's like you could write something that like works, right? Like your client could be like hitting PRs and like progressing, and then it's like you can either like let's just use like a 3-day squat week micro, for example. Like they could be like PRing on that, but then like you might have a thought in the back of your head where you're like, okay, let's just drop them down to two times frequently and see if it works better. Like, are we going to see like an increase more so like in terms of like recovery, more PRs, them feeling stronger, or do they actually need it, right? So I feel like you're going to have this like idea that things are working, but then no matter where you kind of are in, I guess, like the journey with the client, like you're always kind of thinking of ways to obviously make it better again. So that can be where it's like the adjustment of like small little like I guess bench is like the best example where it's like you could be benching like singles multiple times a week. So it's like small adjustments to that could be like making it like that 1% better, or again like taking out a frequency could make it that 1% better, or or it comes to the decision that that they need it. So it's just like there's always little tweaks that you're doing that I guess from our perspective as coaches, it's like we're trying to make things always at 1% better, and then either gives us the answer that they do need it or they don't need it. And then you get to kind of go from there, and then you have this like new layout that sort of, I guess you can just like capitalize on again.
Yeah. Sam, did you want to add to that as well?
Yeah, I was just going to say that like when we do find something as coaches, and we kind of do start to see what works, and then we do run it again and it has success, it's not guaranteed that that's going to keep being successful for the athlete. So like we can't just always glue on to these things that we find and think they're going to work forever. I think like the biggest example of that would be like with my squat that Kelly and I ran. Like, we had this block of like triples, doubles, and singles. We had this like exact map out in terms of how much volume across these 3 blocks, the sets and rep ranges, 5s into 4s into 4s, drop a set in the final block, all that kind of stuff. We ran it again, and it just didn't work the same. So like there can be multiple factors that can make this one thing work at that given time, and it's not guaranteed that when you run something again it's going to work. And then same kind of thing with like the 2-week squat taper that we trialed too. Like we had some data there that my squat felt good in like week 2 of a block, so we trialed a 2-week taper, and then when it actually came to doing the taper and mimicking kind of the same volume intensity in that taper week, it didn't work. So there's no guarantee. So I think it's important to be able to like roll with the punches and kind of just constantly be looking at what's working at that one individual time for the athlete. Similar to kind of what's happened just recently with a client of mine. We had really good success across 3 blocks of training, and then into this new block, I've changed her secondary squat just to high bar, thinking that it would like kind of not elicit the greatest response, more so just to kind of take a little bit of load off, allow her to kind of recover. But it's actually helped even more so, because that block that she ran, a primary squat, she hit like a massive double PR in like week 4 or 5. So kind of touching on what Shania said, that like, sometimes we can kind of think that, okay, this is going to work, I'm going to keep, sticking to this. I changed something to try and move away from that, and it worked even better. So now it's kind of like, oh shit, do I stick with that or do I stick with the old block? So I think it's just, rolling with the punches, not being glued to any kind of individual ideas, and just, going with the flow in terms of how the athlete's responding at one given time.
Yeah. I think that's more powerful than actually chasing something and getting an expected result, right? And it comes to like confirmation bias. Like me personally, I feel like I always have that sense of anxiety when it's like, all right, something's working well. I don't know if it's going to work well the next block. So in my mind, I'm already planning what's next, even though the current moment's like working really well. But at the same time, like you just touched on, Sam, like there was a period of time where you're not actively seeking this out. You're trying to plan for the future, for like the next block ahead when you're trying to re-implement it, right? But then it proves you wrong, and therefore it updates your way of thinking of like what could potentially work, right? And I think that's always going to happen with whoever you work with, right? Like we all come with our biases of what we think works. But then once you try something and then you see the response, that's when you can actually gain true data into like what's happening with the client, right? Because you could always plan ahead and see what's going on. But then once you see the actual response itself, that's when it's like, oh shit, okay, there's something going on here. And you kind of need to like reverse engineer or like re-rationalize what's actually happening. So like for you, I guess thinking about that like high bar to low bar change or low bar to high bar change, do you want to explain why you think changing it from low bar to high bar would have kind of like been suboptimal, and then explain what you think's actually happening?
Yeah, so I guess my initial thought process for this client, Kelly, so we basically had 3 blocks where she ran 3 times a week squat frequency. The secondary was comp squat with top set, so like top double into ascending reps. Middle day was some tempo squats, and then her third day was like SBD, so primary squat, bench, deadlift. Really successful, hit some big PRs at the end of those 3 blocks. And then planning backwards from when States is in December, I kind of thought to have 1 block where we just kind of take a little bit of specificity away, reduce some load, allow her to recover a little bit, because she wasn't like completely injured and banged up, but she was just feeling, you know, the product of that strength progression and the really, really fast results that she had across those 3 blocks. So my thought process was that take some intensity away, take some specificity away, use the high bar to help with some squat patterning as well, in terms of like getting her to push her knees more forward, use her quads more in the squat. And then, yeah, it turned out in that block where it was meant to be kind of like a little bit of a refresh block, by week 5, she performed really well. And then I think kind of, yeah, like obviously lightweight female, we're looking at wanting to kind of give these athletes as much intensity as possible, enough exposure as possible to comp squatting, so it can feel lighter on their back, they can feel confident, and they need that intensity to get stronger. I think what's happened with Kelly is probably in this refresh block where she's almost like washed some fatigue out from the previous 3 blocks. She's hit this 5 weeks, she's still kept some intensity on her primary day, and just kind of washing that fatigue out over 3, 4, 5 weeks with the high bar has allowed the main squat to feel really strong. Also, just technique and squat patterning as well. She's just getting good stimulus in the quads, which I think is also allowing her comp squat to feel really strong by the end of the week as well.
Yeah. Okay. And I mean, that whole process, right, is what we think about every time we plan a block, right? And it's constantly updating with new information. So moving forward, like for yourself, aside from just Kelly, like, do you feel like that would influence or like re-bias you to program a certain way for other people?
Yeah, for sure. I think like, you know, we're always going to have this template, you know, for lightweight females that they need some sort of intensity or higher intensity across their training week, across their 2-3 days of squatting. But I think it's certainly reframed that depending on where they are in their training year into a competition, they don't always need that. So, you know, possibly spending more time with just, you know, 1 to 2 days of higher intensity squatting, or 1 day of higher intensity squatting, and then building volume somewhere else all throughout the training year, and then kind of using that 2 times a week higher intensity frequency when it's needed. So yeah, certainly kind of reframed my thinking in terms of how much they actually need it, but also it's going to be dependent on the person too.
Yeah, for sure. Anyways, I think that will tie things out. But overall, good chat about how we implement structure and flexibility into the program, as well as a bit of a dive into like what goes through a coach's mind of like rationalizing what happens when we make decisions and build up data on the fly, right? Because I feel like aside from this as well, when we can, I guess, learn through like a theoretical knowledge and like looking up things and seeing what works for other people. But until we start making decisions for people and watching the response ourselves, I think that's where the learning also happens, right? It's not just from a textbook or from reading online, it's from actually, planning training for other people ourselves. But overall, thanks guys for listening, and we'll see you in the next episode of the Roundtable. Thanks guys.
Thanks, Annie.
Thanks, Danny.